Workhouses have a notorious reputation in Irish history, and it's not without good reason. During the Great Hunger of the 1840s, over 1/3 of all people who perished in that famine died in one of these institutions. That means over 300,000 Irish people between 1845 and 1851 died in a workhouse. So in this video, I want to look at where workhouses came from, why they were so important during the famine, and then why were mortality rates so high. Before we get into the fascinating history of the 1840s, just let me introduce myself. My name is Finn Dwyer. I'm an Irish historian. I'm also the creator of the Irish History podcast. So if you're looking for more long-form content, check that out at the link below. I'm also making a series on the history of the Great Hunger here on YouTube, and you'll find a playlist with all the videos I've made on the history of the Great Hunger at the end of this video. So check them out there. If you're enjoying these videos and you like this history and you want to see more, please do subscribe to the channel. We're closing in on 40,000 subscribers, which is way beyond my wildest expectations when I started this channel. So if you are enjoying the content, do subscribe. And finally, I just want to say thanks very much for your time and for tuning in. I really appreciate it. Workhouses would play a really important role in the history of the Great Famine of the 1840s, but they were actually very new at the time. So in the late 1830s, the British government completely overhauled how they dealt with destitution and poverty in Ireland and indeed in Britain as well by a series of laws known as the Poor Laws, and these revolutionised the way the poor were treated. Basically, in short, they decided they were going to institutionalise those who were destitute and in need of help. And this saw them open up 130 workhouses across the island of Ireland. But the British government, as I've covered in previous videos, were kind of obsessed with this idea that the poor would take advantage of any system or welfare they were given. So they made these workhouses as unappealing as possible. So for example, if you were destitute and in need of help and you went to a workhouse, when you were admitted, if you went with your family, you'd all be split up. Men went to one area, women to another. Male children to one quarter, female children to the remaining quarter. So the family was split up. On top of that, the food on offer in these workhouses was appalling. So for example, it's stipulated in the Poor Law, which governed these workhouses, that the food provided to the destitute poor in these institutions had to be of a lower standard than what the poor outside the workhouse were eating. The idea here is to deter the poor from entering these institutions. On top of that, as the name implies, the poor were supposed to work in return for their food and board. You also had to sleep in dorms, sleeping side by side with strangers. You were also subjected to a pretty demeaning and humiliating regime inside the workhouse. So generally speaking, even before the famine, these institutions were pretty unappealing. They were stigmatized and the poor would avoid them if possible. But next, let's look now at what happened in 1845 when the Great Famine began and destitution increased. Even before 1845, the British government had been warned by their own officials that the Irish workhouse system could not deal with a major crisis like a famine. It was more designed to tackle day-to-day destitution and poverty that seemed to be endemic in Irish life at the time, but it was in no way positioned to deal with a massive catastrophe. However, as we've already seen in previous videos, from the autumn of 1845 onwards, Ireland is plunged into a major crisis after the failure of the potato crop that pushes about 3 million people into starvation. Now, over the first 2 years of this crisis, the workhouse system doesn't really play a major role. People are very reticent to go into these institutions. As I've already explained, they were pretty stigmatized, and intentionally so. The British government didn't want people going to them, and people didn't turn to these institutions. So even as late as 1846 and the final months of that year, when the situation is getting increasingly desperate, the workhouse system is not full to capacity. So the 128 workhouses by 1846, there'll be another 2 built in early 1847, bringing the full number to 130. But the capacity of these institutions is 115,000, and it doesn't reach full capacity until the early months of 1847. However, in 1847, a culmination of the disastrous policies the British government have operated up until this point, and then a change in strategy, basically pushes the entire crisis onto the workhouse system. And British policies make the workhouse system basically responsible for famine relief, even though they've been warned not to do this. Now, this will create an absolutely calamitous situation. So next I want to look at that more, and then we look at why so many people died in these institutions. So in the first 2 years of the famine, the British government, I've already covered this in previous videos, but they employ a couple of different strategies to try and alleviate the famine. One of them is a public works scheme. It doesn't really work. The second is a soup kitchen scheme in 1847. That works a little bit better. But in August 1847, they withdraw this soup kitchen scheme. And basically at this point, the British government want to wash their hands of the crisis. They feel it's an Irish problem that should be solved by Irish people. And in this light, they basically decide that the workhouse system will be used for all famine relief basically from this point onwards, if possible. Now, the reason they do this is because the British government believe in a principle that Irish property should pay for Irish poverty. And in this, they mean that the wealthy in Ireland should be responsible for the poor in Ireland and that they should pay for famine relief. And the workhouse system seems to fit this perfectly because workhouses are funded by local taxes raised in Ireland and the British government wouldn't be responsible for them. However, this only leads to a calamity because from 1847, or certainly August 1847 onwards, as the British government withdraw their supports and force more and more people into the workhouse system, this basically collapses. So from March 1847 onwards, workhouses are already full to capacity, but British policies in the following months and indeed years force more and more people to turn to workhouses. So by 1848, they've gone way past capacity, and by 1849 they're almost at double capacity. Now the workhouse authorities try and deal with this by renting any buildings they can. So for example, you'll find in Dublin, where the workhouses are some of the largest in the country, the north and south, the Dublin workhouses have a capacity of 2,000 each, but they have to rent old breweries, sheds, anywhere they can put the poor, and their capacity doubles up to about 4,000 people, and they're still massively overcrowded. They also try and rearrange internally the workhouses. So I think I already mentioned that people have to sleep in dorms and share these spaces together, but now they start converting things like kitchen or dining rooms rather into dorms as well. And it's this situation that contributes to those shockingly high death rates I mentioned at the start of this video, where 1 in 3 people who perished in the famine die in a workhouse. Now I want to explore those death rates a little bit more to find out exactly why people were dying in such large numbers. So firstly, workhouses were designed for the destitute in society. That meant that the young, the old and the sick were often the people who turned to them in the largest numbers. So those people were already vulnerable and now find themselves in overcrowded conditions, often being served poor food. So it's not surprising that they die in large numbers. People are sleeping in dorms in massively overcrowded conditions, so it's unsurprising that the death rates soar. Now, to give you a sense of just how many people are dying, in what we might call normal times, that's before the start of the famine in 1845, you might have had about 5,000 deaths in Irish workhouses at that time. That might seem high, but don't forget, workhouses are a place where the old, the sick and the very young tend to go. They're the most vulnerable in society, so you'll have a higher death rate. But anyway, in 1845, in quote unquote normal times, you might expect to have about 5,000 deaths in Irish workhouses. By 1847, that's soaring into the tens of thousands. At the worst of the famine, the death rate in Irish workhouses reaches about 60 or 70,000 people every year. That leads to that figure of 300,000 people over the space of about 5 years between 1846 and 1851. Now, workhouses become the epicenter of the famine, as I've said, because of those British policies that try and force Irish people into them. Now, ultimately, that policy kind of collapses because basically there's not enough money in Ireland to fund the famine relief needed. On top of that, the workhouse system that they've constructed is very bureaucratic. They're obsessed with this idea that the poor will just kind of scam the system if they can. But eventually they do have to kind of change this. So they will, in the later years of the famine, provide what's called outdoor relief. That's basically where the poor in the most destitute areas will be given food even if they're living at home. But this gives you some sense about why workhouses become so important in the history of the Great Famine. It's that the British government, as the famine drags on, tries to channel all famine relief through the workhouse system, a system that was specifically not designed to do this and wasn't financially able to deal with a crisis of that size. The British government will eventually have to loan a lot of money to the workhouse system, but they never really acknowledged the levels of crisis and that the fact that they have forced famine relief onto this system, the poor law system that just cannot deal with it. Now, to finish off the video, I do want to just talk about burials in workhouses because I've already said you've got this phenomenally high death rate in workhouses, over 300,000 people in the space of just 5 or 6 years. And many workhouse authorities in those years are completely completely overwhelmed by this situation. In some workhouses, they had to turn to mass burial grounds. I've already mentioned in a previous video about how in Kilkenny in the early 2000s, they actually uncovered a mass grave there that had 970 famine era burials. And that's because the workhouse authorities of the time were overwhelmed by the scale of death taking place in that institution. But it wasn't just in Kilkenny. Other workhouses had to turn to similar situations where they buried the dead in mass graves because they simply couldn't handle the levels of mortality taking place, particularly in the worst years of the famine. Now, if you have any comments, questions or queries, please do drop a comment below this video. I try and answer your comments in videos that I make. So if you have a comment, I'll try and get around to making a video on it. And finally, I will say thanks again for tuning in. I really appreciate your time.